Welcome back to Grimverse History, where we uncover the strange and forgotten sides of history. Tonight, we uncover the horrifying truth behind the secret rituals of ancient Egypt. What did the priests do to the Pharaoh's daughters? And how did these sacred rites reveal the darkest secrets of an empire built on divine power? The answer will shatter everything you thought you knew about Egypt's glory. Imagine this. The young princess, her body draped in the finest linen, her skin scented with oils of frankincense and myrrh, ready to be elevated to the gods themselves. She walks through corridors carved in stone that have withstood the test of time. The ritual she is about to partake in, the highest honor a royal daughter could receive, was not only meant to elevate her, it would take her into the very depths of human suffering. What you don't know, what has been buried for centuries, is that this was no mere spiritual offering. The priests' rites weren't just about honor. They were twisted and cruel, a horrifying contradiction to the grandeur of the kingdom. The Pharaoh's daughters were marked not as goddesses, but as sacrifices, their purity exploited by the very men who were meant to protect them. Now, imagine you push open the heavy stone door. The air is thick with the smell of damp stone and burning incense. Flickering candlelight dances on the walls, casting long shadows in the cold, echoing chamber. As you step further inside, you feel the chill of ancient secrets pressing in on you. The scent of myrrh and frankincense fills your senses, but there's something else. Something heavy, dark, and unsettling. You know this is no ordinary temple. What is about to unfold here will forever change the course of history. Take a deep breath. Let the noise of your day fade away. You're safe here. Before we dive into tonight's chilling tale, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Grimverse History, and turn on the notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the most haunting and forgotten corners of our past. And now, dim the lights. Let the hum of your fan become your heartbeat. Slow your thoughts as we journey back to a time where divine power and darkness collided in the most horrific of ways. It's the year 714 BC. The Temple of Karnak stands tall, the air thick with incense and the chants of priests. In the heart of the sacred chambers, a ritual is unfolding, a ritual no one dares to speak of. Stay with me. The truth is about to be uncovered. The ancient Egyptians were masters of blending the sacred with the political. It was perhaps the most inconvenient truth of their civilization. Religion wasn't just something you believed in. It was something you sacrificed for. It was a tool, a weapon, and it ran deep in the veins of their politics. One of the most striking manifestations of this merging was the wife of Amun system, a ritualized practice that intertwined the sacred duties of Egypt's gods with the power dynamics of the pharaohs. For the Egyptian rulers, nothing was too sacred when it came to maintaining control, and nothing was more sacred than their daughters. In the shadows of Egypt's monumental temples, the priests of Amun, Egypt's supreme deity, waited, their ritual practices wrapped in a mix of divine reverence and cold calculation. The pharaohs, knowing full well the political need to maintain power over Egypt's priesthood, had one very simple solution: their daughters. The young women, often royal princesses, were offered up to the god as wives, not in the way we might think of a marriage, but as a sacrifice. A religious binding that ensured the pharaoh's control over both the spiritual and the political spheres. To be clear, this wasn't some benign honor granted to the royal daughters. The wife of Amun was an extremely powerful position, yes, but it was one tainted with a brutal reality. It was not an act of veneration, it was an act of political survival. The daughters were bound to the god, not just through a symbolic act, but through a more visceral, disturbing one. Their position as wives to Amun ensured that the priesthood's power would remain uncontested, and in return, the pharaohs received a strange form of protection. The politics of divine favor were complex, so much so that human lives became part of the equation. The pharaohs, in their efforts to maintain control, didn't just send their daughters off to marry the god. No, they participated in the ritual, placing their daughters in positions where they were used, both spiritually and politically. The daughters, in essence, became the god's vessels, and this marriage was never meant to be a normal union. They were often kept within the temple complex, isolated from the world outside, and their lives were no longer their own. So, how did this sacred practice begin? How did it evolve from a spiritual offering into an unspoken contract of political survival? Imagine walking through one of those grand temples, the smell of burning incense filling the air. Your steps echoing off the stone walls. The silence is almost deafening, but not in the way you might think. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's the kind of silence that fills your chest, the kind that makes your breath catch in your throat. And here, in this sacred space, the daughters of the pharaoh are not revered. They're sacrificed, molded into something far darker than the light of the gods. But the question remains, what does it mean to truly sacrifice your own flesh and blood for the sake of power? Because, as history has shown, the price of this power, this divine favor, was steep. The pharaohs weren't just trying to keep the priesthood in check. They were trying to make sure no one ever questioned their right to rule. And as for the daughters, they had no choice but to comply. Their fate was written long before they were born, in the palace corridors where politics and religion met. These girls were destined for lives of devotion to Amun, trapped between the sacred and the political. The 9th day of the 3rd month of Arket, 714 years before Christ, a princess walks through corridors carved from limestone that has stood for 1,000 years. Her name is Shepenwit, daughter of Pharaoh Osaran III, and she is 14 years old. She wears white linen so fine it required 6 months to weave. Gold circlets her wrists and throat. Her hair has been dressed with oils that smell of myrrh and frankincense. By every visible measure, she is being prepared for the highest honor a royal daughter can receive. She is terrified. The corridors lead deeper into the temple of Karnak, past public halls where common people leave offerings, past courtyards where priests perform ceremonies visible to thousands. These are the spaces her father knows, the spaces that appear in official accounts, the spaces that represent Egyptian religion as divine order and sacred majesty. But she walks beyond those spaces now, through doorways that only priests may pass, down passages that narrow with each turn, toward chambers that exist in no public record, toward rituals that will never be described in hieroglyphs meant for common eyes. 3 priestesses accompany her. They are not guards exactly. They do not restrain her. One of them, the eldest, speaks. You understand the honor being bestowed upon you. You will become God's wife of Amun. You will speak for the divine. You will mediate between the earthly realm and the celestial. Your father's kingdom depends on your service. Shepenwit thought she was about to receive the highest honor any princess could wish for. In her mind, she was being prepared for a role of divine importance, a sacred duty to serve the gods. Her beauty, her youth, were to be consecrated in a ritual of purity and elevation. She would walk among the gods, her name etched in eternity. But little did she know, the ceremony she was about to endure was nothing like she imagined. It was not the glorification of a goddess. It was the stripping away of everything that made her human. She could feel the cool air of the temple against her skin, the scent of incense so thick it stung her nostrils. The heavy robes draped over her body felt almost suffocating, the weight of them too much for someone so young. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she stood still, eyes lowered in reverence. She was told she was chosen for something grand. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that she was being prepared to become nothing more than a vessel, a tool in the hands of priests who had far more to gain than any of their sacrifices. The ceremony began like any other sacred rite. The chants, the rhythmic beating of drums, the flickering light from torches that cast long shadows on the stone walls. She had been told that this was her moment to step into a divine role. But as she knelt before the altar, something shifted in the air. The sense of holiness that had surrounded her began to sour, like milk left out too long in their heat. There were no gods here, no divine presence. There were only the priests, eyes cold and calculating. They told her it was for purification, for the good of the kingdom, for the blessing of Amun. But it wasn't purification. It was humiliation. It wasn't a blessing. It was a shackle. The first cut wasn't physical. It was the cut of her identity, her humanity. She was no longer a princess, no longer a daughter of the Pharaoh. She was a vessel, nothing more. The priests surrounded her, their voices low, murmuring their incantations. The air felt thick, pressing in on her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She only felt the cold hands of the priests on her, leading her into the darkness where nothing made sense anymore. The purity they promised was a lie. The holiness was a facade. What was being stripped away wasn't just her royal title. It was her very essence, piece by piece, until all that remained was the shell of a girl who had once dreamed of something far different. But as the ritual continued, there was no turning back. The walls of the temple were closing in around her, the scent of incense now heavy and suffocating. The weight of her robes felt like chains, binding her to a fate she had never chosen. She had become a part of something much larger, much darker than she could have ever imagined. Her identity, her voice, was being erased, replaced by the will of the priests. They told her she was part of something greater, that she was serving the divine. But the divine didn't speak to her. The priests did, and their voices were filled with command, not reverence. Their eyes, cold and unfeeling, saw nothing but the power they could wield through her. She was the instrument of that power, no longer a girl with hopes and dreams, but a symbol of a kingdom built on control. And just like that, the weight of the world shifted. What was supposed to be an honor had become a prison. Shepenwit, in that moment, understood that the god she was meant to serve had no face. The only faces she saw were those of the men who held her fate in their hands. The sacred had been turned into something unrecognizable. She was no longer a daughter of Egypt, but a sacrifice to its power. And there was no way out. And so, the ritual continued, through the night, through the hours, through the endless chants and commands. The priests performed their sacred duty, while Shepenwit's humanity was stripped away with each passing second. There was no joy, no peace, only the cold, unyielding grip of a system that used her, used all of them, for something far darker than any religious rite should ever be. The ritual wasn't about worship. It was about control. Shepenwit, once a cherished daughter of the Pharaoh, was now part of something much darker than she could have ever imagined. The path from royalty to servitude was not sudden, nor was it marked by any grand gesture. It was a gradual process, one that unfolded in the cold, echoing chambers of the temple, where the priests of Amun patiently stripped away everything that made her who she was. And as she stood there, her identity slowly slipping through her fingers like sand, Shepenwit realized something unsettling. She was no longer a person. She was a tool, a means to an end, a pawn in a game that stretched far beyond her comprehension. The priests, with their serene faces and carefully cultivated power, knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't need to break her spirit all at once. No, that would be far too obvious. Instead, they worked patiently, methodically, using their rituals to erase any trace of the girl she had been. Each chant, each gesture, each sacred word spoke less of gods and more of control. The more she bowed her head, the more they had her. The more they claimed her body, the more her soul was silently handed over, piece by piece. It wasn't just the rituals themselves that were the problem. It was the system behind them, a complex web of religion and politics that had no room for family, no space for affection. The daughter of a pharaoh, a member of the royal bloodline, was no longer allowed to be tied to anything as human as love or kinship. She had become something else, something far less human. The priests didn't need her as a princess. They needed her as a tool. There was no room for Shepenwit's royal identity in this new world. She was no longer the daughter of the pharaoh, no longer a future queen. She was a vessel, empty, ready to be filled with whatever the priests needed. They didn't just steal her identity, they redefined it, and they did so under the guise of spiritual purity. What they called sacred rites was, in reality, a well-crafted system of control, a way to transform the daughters of the pharaohs into instruments of power for the priesthood. The system was brilliant in its simplicity, religion masked as divinity, but ultimately a tool for domination. The idea of control, wrapped in layers of religious ritual, was a cold truth that no one dared to question. Shepenwit had no choice but to submit. She was made to kneel, made to bow, to accept the lies wrapped in the garments of holiness. The priests knew that to maintain their power, they had to ensure that the royal bloodline was bound to them, not through loyalty, but through manipulation. The very rituals that were supposed to elevate her to divine status were the same ones that buried her under the weight of servitude. She no longer saw herself as the beloved daughter of Egypt. She couldn't. She had no connection left to her family, no identity of her own. She was simply a tool for the priests to use, to control, to shape into whatever they needed to keep their power intact. The grand promises of honor and glory faded, replaced by the cold, oppressive reality of her new role. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was how the priests made it seem so natural. They didn't force Shepenwit into submission. No, they simply guided her there. With each word, each ritual, each whispered prayer, she was led to believe that this was her fate. Her identity, who she had been, was irrelevant. All that mattered was her utility. The priests were in control. The pharaoh's daughter was not. The more Shepenwit surrendered to the rites, the more the illusion grew. The priest's power over her wasn't just physical, it was mental, psychological. They were masters of manipulation, bending her reality until she no longer knew where the divine ended and their control began. The sacred and the profane were one in their hands, and Shepenwit was nothing more than a vessel, a tool that would serve the temple's needs, not her own. And so, she was transformed, quietly, without fanfare. It wasn't a tragic fall. No, it was a slow, steady erasure. Her life, her family, her identity, all discarded under the weight of a ritual that was as much about control as it was about spirituality. The system worked. It always does, doesn't it? The priests of Amun, with their quiet authority and calculated smiles, were experts at making the most unimaginable horrors seem divine. Words like holy duty and marriage to the god slipped from their lips with a softness that made everything sound pure, even righteous. But beneath these lofty terms was a system of control so sinister, so suffocating, that it could never be described openly. After all, who would dare speak the truth of what happened behind the temple walls? The so-called sacred rites were nothing more than a well-crafted deception, a ritualized abuse hidden under the mask of reverence. Shepenwit, like the others, was told that her role was one of honor, a divine calling, but it was all a carefully constructed lie. There was no honor in what was done to her, no divine presence in the ceremonies. Instead, there was isolation, manipulation, and a systematic stripping away of her identity. The more she bowed her head, the more her sense of self slipped away. The robes she wore, once symbols of royal dignity, became shackles. The once powerful princess was now just another piece in a game much larger than her. The process was slow, insidious. It started with the rituals, the promises, the divine marriage to Amun. But it didn't end there. No, the real trick was in the isolation. They didn't just take her family away, they erased her connection to the world. Shepenwit wasn't allowed to speak to the outside world. No letters, no visits. Her voice was silenced under the weight of holy silence. The priests knew the power of control lay not in just the act, but in the process. Once they had isolated her, they had her. Once they severed her ties to her past, they could mold her into anything they wanted. She was no longer a princess. She was an instrument, a tool for the priests to wield at their will. But it wasn't just Shepenwit. No, the system wasn't that careless. It needed to work. The priests had built a network, a carefully maintained web of dependencies and loyalties. They created a family of followers, a circle of enforcers who upheld the system, making sure that no one questioned it. The priesthood was self-sustaining, feeding off the power it generated by controlling not just the daughters of the Pharaoh, but everyone around them. The servants, the guards, even the family members. They were all tied to the temple, bound to the system, whether they knew it or not. The walls of the temple grew taller, thicker, as Shepenwit's life became smaller, narrower. The scent of incense filled the air, thick and sweet, drowning out the sounds of the world outside. Her world had shrunk to the size of the sacred chamber, and the priests, those calm, composed figures, were the only ones who had a voice in it. The outside world no longer mattered. It was a distant memory, like a dream fading with the morning light. After all, once you've built a system that controls not just people, but their very perception of reality, there's no turning back. The system, like all systems built on control, thrives on its own continuity. It doesn't just survive, it perpetuates itself. The wives of Amun, once victims of a system that stripped them of their identity, now find themselves in the position of being complicit in the very machinery that ensnared them. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of survival. In a twisted reflection of their own fate, they become part of the cycle, mentors even, guiding new recruits into the very trap they fell into. Picture this. The young, fresh-faced princess, her eyes wide with both fear and anticipation, standing in the same halls that once echoed with the laughter of youth. The same halls where Shepenwit once thought she would be honored. Now, she is not the victim, but the teacher. The rituals she once endured, the cold touch of the priest's hands, the suffocating weight of the ceremonial robes. These things become lessons to pass on. What was once done to her is now something she does. She is a part of the machinery now, and in a way, she has to be. The alternative is unthinkable. They train the next generation, not just in the rites of Amun, but in submission. It's almost clinical. The words they once heard are now their own. Sacred, divine, honor. All the terms that once felt like a warm embrace now feel cold and hollow. Yet they still use them. They teach the young ones to bow, to kneel, to give up their identities in service of a system they've learned to trust. Because in their world, trust is a necessity. The system has to work. For them, for everyone. And so, they participate. They become enforcers, even though they've been bound by the same invisible chains. The strangest part, perhaps, is how easily the system renews itself. Like a plant that grows from its own roots, the victims of this cycle don't just fade into the background. They become its most dedicated participants. It's not about cruelty anymore. It's about perpetuating the only world they know. To break the cycle would mean to shatter their own existence. And so, they continue to nurture it, feeding it the same way they once fed their own hunger for purpose. But in the cold silence of the temple, something still lingers. There is always a question. Why do we perpetuate systems that bind us? Why do the victims continue to play their part? The answer, like most things in life, is simple, yet unsettling. Because they have no choice. They are the guardians of a system that has become too vast, too intertwined with their own sense of being to escape. And the truth is, it doesn't matter who enters the cycle. The machine hums, and it will continue to turn, whether or not they choose to be its gears. On the surface, the lives of Egypt's royal daughters appeared to be nothing less than divine. Publicly, they were revered, hailed as sacred vessels for the gods. The priests spoke of them in hushed tones of respect, their names tied to the divine like jewels on a royal crown. Shepenwit, like the others, played her part, smiling for the crowds, bowing to the gods, standing tall with the weight of her new role. She wore her ceremonial robes with grace, her face bathed in the soft glow of the temple's flickering lights, an image of purity and holiness. Yet beneath the surface, within the cold, dimly lit chambers of the temple, the truth of her existence was something entirely different. The reality was far darker than the public's perception. It was a life of quiet destruction, psychological and physical torment, hidden beneath layers of ritualistic reverence. Shepenwit may have walked with her head held high, but her mind was imprisoned, shackled by an invisible force that whispered to her, reminding her of her new identity. Not as a beloved princess, but as a tool, an object of worship, a thing to be used. The priests, their hands gentle but cold, had no need to break her spirit all at once. They chipped away at it slowly, methodically, until all that was left was a hollow shell of what she once was. The system, this finely crafted web of power, was relentless. It didn't care about the inner torment of its victims. It didn't care about their well-being or whether they found peace. What mattered was control. What mattered was the perpetuation of the system itself. The priests and the political powers behind them knew exactly how to maintain that control. By isolating the princesses from the world they had once known, by making them silent, compliant, and most importantly, by ensuring they had no place to escape. And escape was impossible. The wives of Amun couldn't leave. They couldn't speak out. The very nature of their existence within the temple rendered them voiceless. No matter how they might have longed for freedom, no matter how they might have dreamt of life beyond the temple walls, they were trapped. The psychological toll was insidious, weaving itself into their minds like a poison that slowly erodes from within. But here's the irony. They were expected to endure, not just for themselves, but for the temple, for the priests, for the kingdom. And when they became part of the system, when they were entrenched within its power structure, they weren't just victims anymore. They became enforcers too. They became the ones who, in their turn, would train the next generation to take their place. The cycle of abuse continued. its perpetuation guaranteed by the victims themselves, each one trained to serve the temple, to maintain the status quo, to ensure the system never faltered. The system, however, didn't end because of some grand moral awakening. No, it crumbled only when the political tides of Egypt shifted. When the power structure changed, when the pharaohs lost their grip, the system collapsed. Not because of any moral outcry, but because the priest's control of the royal family was no longer viable. The soft whispers of the temple fade into silence. The flicker of candlelight gently dims. The heavy scent of incense lingers in the air. A story that once seemed so distant now settles quietly within the walls of this room. The ancient rituals, their echoes fading like the last breath of a forgotten age. And as the night wraps around us, we leave those distant echoes behind. You feel the cool, steady rhythm of your own breath again. The ancient world, its secrets, its shadows, slowly retreats. If you've journeyed with me tonight, thank you. If the story lingered in your mind, share it with others. Like, share, and subscribe, so we can explore more hidden corners of history together. Goodbye, and we will meet again.